Graham Weaver is the founder and managing partner of Alpine Investors. He started Alpine out of his dorm room at Stanford and started buying companies with his credit card. Over the last 22 years, he's built a private equity firm with $16 billion in assets under management. In this conversation, Weaver unpacks his unique strategy of building Alpine, what daily habits have dramatically transformed his life, and why he believes we should all strive to live an asymmetric life. Graham, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Paulina.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. Okay, so I want to start at an interesting place. Your parents got divorced when you were 13, and I read that you've said that their divorce felt like the earth was shifting under me, and that's the period in your life where you stumbled across self-help in your local library. You say that discovery changed your life. How so?
Well, I think when you're a teenager in general, you're sort of looking for something to grab onto. You're figuring out who you are. You're self-aware for the first time. And because my home life was unsettling, I was really looking for something to grab onto. And I mowed lawns at the time. I spent probably 7 or 8 hours every weekend mowing lawns in Perrysburg, Ohio. That was the best way I could find to make money. And I had a Sony Walkman, and I would listen to music for a long time. And then one day I was going to the library to check out some music, and there was this book that said Think and Grow Rich. And I remember thinking, who doesn't want to think and grow rich? So I, checked that out, and almost from the first sentence, I was just completely enthralled. And it was, of course, Napoleon Hill's famous book. And then I listened to that book, I don't even know how many times. And then our library had a whole self-help section, and I just got really into that. And it was Brian Tracy, Earl Nightingale, Tony Robbins, folks, people like that. And their content was just outstanding in hindsight. Even today, when I look back, it was just really phenomenal content. And to be able to grab onto something like that at that age was just really powerful. So that, the general premise, if I had to summarize all of that, was just, be intentional about what you want to do with your life, set some goal, write it down. They were all in favor of writing it down every day in the present tense. And then I added, writing down the things that I was going to do to work toward that goal. And the first couple things I wrote down came true really quickly. And then I got addicted, and I still use that same practice today. I write my goals down every day.
That's really interesting. It reminds me of David Goggins talks about the accountability mirror, where he'll post little sticky notes on his mirror that say, like, go 1 day without lying for validation, or run 2 miles, or things like small actions that he can take every day to reach his goals. Is that what you did? Or was it more like, I have this grand goal and I'm going to break it down and write that down every day?
It was very granular. So there was a lot going on at that time. I was cutting a lot of weight for wrestling. I was right around 6 feet tall. I'm 6'1" now, but I was about 6 feet tall at the time, and I wrestled 125. So I was skin and bone. So I was really careful about my diet. So I would write that down. I would write down every homework assignment I had, where I was, when I was going to finish it. I would write down the times I wanted to run in my morning runs. I'd write down how much I weighed, how much I wanted to weigh, how much I thought I'd weigh tomorrow. That wasn't super healthy. I'm not recommending that, but that was what I did. And I literally would write my goals out multiple times a day. So it got very, very granular, but it had the impact of just harnessing my mind and my energy on where I wanted to go. I didn't realize how powerful that was, but I just started knocking things down consistently, and it became a habit. I think you build self-esteem by making and keeping small commitments to yourself. And that's exactly what I didn't know that at the time, but that was the effect of those little goals.
Yeah. I think it's Reid Hoffman once said consistency plus time equals trust. And he meant it more as in, like, when you're doing business deals or any sort of relationship, if you're consistent and keep your promises over a long period of time, people will trust you. But I think it's very similar to keeping the promises to yourself.
Yeah, consistency plus time is is almost undefeated. If you, for me at least, is moving toward one thing for a long enough time, daily and consistently. I don't know. There aren't many obstacles that will not yield to that formula.
Absolutely. So, okay. So when you were in college, you started your private equity firm, Alpine, out of your dorm room. And what I found fascinating is you were buying the companies on your credit card, which sounds exactly like what I would do if somebody was like, start a private equity firm tomorrow. Tell me about the origin story of Alpine.
So what happened was I worked on Wall Street, like at the normal Wall Street job where I learned nothing. Basically, they make Wall Street out to be this big thing and it's really exciting, but basically they crammed 1 month of learning into 2 years. And so like I learned how to build a financial model and then repeated that. And
what were you doing on Wall Street exactly?
So I worked at a private equity firm.
Okay.
I worked at Morgan Stanley's private equity firm. At the time, there were only, I think that was the only firm that hired the only private equity firm that hired directly out of college, and I worked there. And so we built financial models, did that for 2 years, got to be able to do it really quickly, but that was about it. Then I worked at a small firm with only 2 people for about 18 months. And that was amazing. I learned a ton from 2 people, really good training. I learned the mechanics of buying a business. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what a good business was. I didn't know how to assess it, but I knew mechanically the process for buying a business. and I conflated that with, I know how to buy a company. I'm going to be a great investor. Yeah. So then I show up at business school. I went to Stanford Business School. I show up in my first class and it's the first quarter. And I had this, I had a great experience with that last firm. And I show up and I'm sitting there and there's this 25-year-old TA who's a PhD student, never worked a day in his life. And he's teaching a strategy. And it was his first time teaching. He's like literally reading out of the textbook. And I was thinking to myself, what did I just do? I just gave up 2 years, paid all this money. I'm in debt. I better do something. I better make this mean something. So I said, I'm going to go buy a company. So I started cold calling label printing businesses because that was an industry I kind of knew a little bit. They were small companies where you could have local economies of scale. And I started cold calling them. I found an owner who wanted to sell his business. I did all this work over the phone because I'm 25 years old. He didn't know how old I was. And when I actually showed up, you could just see his face drop because I was 25. I looked like I was about 14 at the time. Yeah. And actually, funny story, I was like so late to that meeting. It was a 3-hour meeting and it was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they didn't change the clocks. So I was an hour late before I even started because I had the daylight savings times wrong. And then I was about another 45 minutes late because I got lost. So it wasn't a good start. But anyway, what you could do back then is, I would get debt that was securitized by the assets of the company, the presses and the accounts receivable and the inventory and things like that. That was a decent amount of the purchase price. Then some more debt from the bank that just gave it based on cash flow. And then I got more debt, which was subordinated debt, which was really expensive, like 17% money. And then he gave me some seller debt. So I financed most of the purchase price with debt. And then there was a tiny sliver of equity. And back then, Capital One was launching these things. You would get these checks literally in your mail that would say, write yourself a check for $50,000 and pay no interest for 12 months. And I just did that. I did that like 7 times. And that was my equity. And then you would get other ones that would say, roll your credit card and pay no interest. So I had this elaborate spreadsheet about where the interest was going to start hitting me at some point. But once again, not recommended, not like that's the way to do it, but that was just how I did it back then. And that was kind of the beginning of Alpine, not your typical origin story.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so you've been doing this with Alpine for 22 years. Fast forward to today, you just raised a $4.5 billion buyout fund in a very challenging fundraising environment. What would you say is kind of one of the fundamental keys to building trust with your limited partners over the last 2 decades?
It's a great question. So we have 3 pillars, not to sound like a marketing pitch, but this is actually the answer to your question. We have 3 pillars. One of which is we're going to be the number 1 performing fund of all time, as measured by net return on capital, not by how much assets we manage or IRRs or other things, but actually you give me $1, how many dollars do I give you back? That's our number one. That's how we measure it. And our number one objective is to be the number one firm in the world at that metric. Our number two objective is to be the place where the best people want to come and work. And number 3 is to use all that to be a force for social good. But the first one is shocking how rare that is. how rare it is for someone to set that performance goal as an objective. So we set that as a goal in 2009. By the way, when the time we set that goal, we had no business setting it. We didn't have great performance. And we put it in writing, just like I was saying before.
Why did you do that?
Well, the first 10 years of Alpine was underwhelming. We lost money on our first fund. The next 2 funds were kind of okay. And then the recession hit us in 2008 and we got flattened. So we're basically on the edge of going out of business. And I hired this executive coach, which was the first time I didn't even know what an executive coach was.
Yeah.
I didn't know what they did. I thought when I hired my coach, by the way, I thought he was going to tell me exactly what to do, which is not what happens at all. They just ask a lot of questions. And in the process of that coaching, I started to realize I had all these limiting beliefs, all these like barriers were coming up. I can't be good because of this. We don't deserve this. We can't hire good people. We can't raise more money. We're not. And it was amazing. Like these things just like poured out of myself and the other people who worked at Alpine. And then once we had those out of our mind and on paper, we could look at them objectively. They didn't have control over us. And so we just started plowing forward through those things. It really was that. It was about our psychology, not about our strategy, not about our assets, or it was really started with, and I think this is true for every company, it starts with the psychology of the owner or the psychology of the CEO. And then I changed my psychology. And something I should have known how to do because I learned that, mowing lawns, but I'd kind of gotten in the fog of war and forgotten all that. And so as soon as we started changing that, then we started setting really aspirational goals and then working backwards from those and then just delivering, just putting our heads down, put the helmet on and actually delivering on that. And we put metrics to every single goal so that we knew how we were doing against those. And then at some point, our team started believing it. At some point, we started believing it. And that happened way before we ever hit it. So like I always say, like when you set this aspirational goal, that's something exciting like that, part of you assumes the identity of someone who's already achieved that goal.
Absolutely.
So if you write down, we are the number one performing private equity firm in the world every day on your walls and your stuff, and part of you starts behaving like that way before you've ever achieved it. And that actually started happening. And then we just built some momentum, and then, that was kind of the real turning point for us.
And because as you're talking, I'm thinking like 22 years, that means that you've weathered multiple crises,
Yeah.
like the dot-com bubble, the financial crisis, COVID, now inflation, whatever's going on.
By the way, we weathered all of those plus 3 times as many just self-inflicted crises that you're not even describing. But yes, definitely all those crises, and then many more that we're shooting ourselves.
Self-inflicted.
Yeah, exactly.
So what have you learned about like crisis leadership in that time?
I actually think Ben Horowitz in his book, The Hard Things About Hard Things, talks about wartime CEOs and peacetime CEOs. I think I'm a wartime CEO. I think I do better when the pressure's on, when there's urgency, when we can just corral the forces. The thing that I tell our team, and that which I truly believe, is that there's no such thing as a good or bad market. That sounds, you might think that that's counterintuitive, but if the market is crashing and has crashed, like that means that people might not have money. There might be people that have to sell. It might be a great time to hire talent because nobody's hiring. It might be a great time to do add-on acquisitions where you can fold the businesses in. And when things are cranking and everyone believes the world's going to go on and be great forever, it's a great time to sell, great time to be really careful, great time to get out of businesses that you wouldn't be able to get out of in other markets. So my general philosophy is like, take what the market gives you and react to that. And there's always something good that's coming out of the market, even in the Great Recession. I mean, the fund that we raised right around the Great Recession was really our first coming out party for our performance.
Yeah. It's really interesting because every founder that I've interviewed, regardless of industry, like I interviewed Danny Meyer in the restaurant world and Ron Shaich, the founder of Panera, and they all said that it's really interesting, like recent founders, if they started their company in a boom time, they just assume that it's going to last forever. And if you've been doing this for so long, you know that everything's temporary. So that's interesting how it plays within your strategy.
Yeah, you don't want to read your press too much on the way up or the way down. So it can be dangerous in both cases. You're not probably as good as you think you are when the market's good, and you're not as bad as you think you are when it's bad. So you have to temper things. And again, I learned that the hard way.
And just out of curiosity, how many of your original LPs are still with you today?
Not as many as you might think. We have, because here's why, because in the early days, like imagine you're a 27-year-old raising a fund, you have no track record, and you look like you're 14. There's a certain type of investor that wants to invest in that. And our first one was $54 million. So that attracts a certain, by the way, the answer to that question is, has to be an individual capable of making that decision, him or herself, because there's no institution that's going to say yes, because there's just too much risk and downside. So the first few funds was largely individuals and family offices. And then as we grow, now $4.5 billion, now the people who like to invest in us are pension funds and insurance funds and big endowments and things like that. So we have some that were there for most of the time. And we have some that have small ones that have been there the whole time, some individuals, but the composition does change over time.
Got it. And I read that you go into every sale with an offense deck and a defense deck. Can you explain what these are?
Yeah. So I think if you're selling anything, you want to have an offense deck and a defense deck. So the offense deck is what you would think. It says, here's the 3 or 4 reasons why you have to buy this company. This is why you have to own it. And you can be a little aspirational, not untruthful, but aspirational in that, in selling the dream and the vision. And so we spend a lot of time on painting that vision. By the way, we paint the vision for ourselves and then hopefully live into it. And then we want to paint the vision for the next buyer too. The defense deck is what's probably more interesting, which is, what are all the reasons they're not going to want to invest or not going to want to buy? So when we fundraise, we have a defense that here's all the objections. By the way, if you sat down for 10 minutes and just listed out all the objections, you're almost never going to have someone come up with one you didn't come up with. Mm-hmm. So the objections aren't that complicated. They're going to be things you generally already know. And then here's the counterintuitive part. You actually want to bring all of the defense into the meeting. So for example, if someone says, like in the early days, hey, obviously one of my big defenses, you have no track record. What I want to say is, you're probably thinking, I have no track record. And then they're like, yeah, I am thinking that's exactly what I'm thinking. So you're gaining credibility, and then you have the opportunity to move them from there with your bullet points. What a lot of people are like, they get out of that meeting and they say, oh gosh, thank God my lack of track record didn't come up at the meeting. But then it comes up behind closed doors, and you never actually have an ability to dissuade someone of that objection. So the counterintuitive part is make the defense deck and then talk about that in the meeting. If they don't invest, fine. But you got to go down swinging, giving your best pitch on those objections.
That's such a good point. And it also kind of disarms them, right? If they come in hot, you're like, I already know what your objections are going to be.
And it builds trust because they say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. You're 27 and you have no track record. Yeah. Now they're listening because they're thinking that's exactly what I was thinking coming in the meeting. Now you may or may not get them to get excited about it, but at least you're giving your best shot.
That's such a good point. So you actually recommend making both decks, but using the points of the defense deck in the offense deck.
Absolutely. Yeah. You want to bring up the objections proactively in the meeting.
Got it. That's really good. So on a more personal note, you've said that one of the biggest lessons you've learned in your life and career is that the real battle in life is an internal one. So what has that been for you, and how do you recommend that other people can actually identify what it is for them?
I mean, that's such a deep question, Paulina. So, if you go back to the story I told earlier, where I thought that the problem with Alpine was the market and the assets and the kinds of deals we were doing. The real problem was our psychology, what we believed to be true, what the limiting beliefs that we held, the lack of these ability for us to hit these aggressive targets. That was actually the battle. So the battle in that was an internal battle of feeling like we're enough, feeling like we're worthy of what's about, what we want in this world. And that preceded any external battle. And the world always presents itself to you as a bunch of external battles. There's this problem, this employee quits, all those things. And of course, that's all happening. But remember, you're the one who's putting meaning on it. You're the one who's deciding what that narrative means. You're also the one who's deciding the game you're playing, what the score of that game is, how you're keeping score, and when you really add up all that, like, this life is mostly happening in your mind, and I know that sounds weird because it does present itself as a whole series of external things. But remember, every external thing that ever happens goes through this massive filter, and then you are interpreting it, putting meaning on it, placing relevance. You're winning, you're losing, all those kinds of things. So that's my short version. There, we could talk about this for 4 hours, but I've definitely been on this big kick of Buddhism and meditation where I've been spending a lot of energy on this exact topic.
Interesting. And just to dig a little deeper here, so you've said that time spent working on yourself is the highest returning investment you'll ever make. I'm curious about some of your daily habits that you believe have had the highest ROI in your life.
Yeah, great question. I would put those in really simply 2 buckets. The first bucket is, we'll say, health and just being physically in bringing my best physical self to life. And the reason that I prioritize that so high is literally, like, what I started to realize is if I feel amazing, I have an amazing day. Like, it is pretty much 100% correlated, irrespective of what's going on in the day. Is I'm charged up, I'm excited, then I have a good day. So I was like, I'm going to try to solve that, because then life is going to be pretty good. So on that list is sleep. Huge fan of sleep. I just wrote a blog on that yesterday. And so just, spend a lot of energy on sleep habits. And so I try to get 7 or 8 hours of sleep, and I'm pretty good about that. Then do something cold. So a cold plunge, cold shower right away kind of wakes you up. There's a lot of science on the immune system and what that does. But if nothing else, it just gets you going. It gets you up. I meditate for 30 minutes a day. 20 minutes of that is I do a breathing exercise, the Wim Hof breathing. And then I do 20 minutes of meditating. That's amazing. Gets kind of me in the right mindset about just being present for the day. And then I work out. And that's my morning. I don't put things on the calendar typically until 10 a.m. so I can actually really complete that morning routine consistently. I have the luxury of being able to do that, but people have a lot more flexibility and control than they think they do. If you just block that time, stuff just tends to work around it. So, and then I do, and then in that same time before 10 a.m., I'm going to do my most cerebral task, whatever that is: writing a lecture, writing a blog, reading something, working on a strategy, reading some board materials, things that take some energy. So that's kind of the morning routine. I don't drink alcohol. I don't drink caffeine. Don't eat gluten. I don't take sleeping pills. I try to keep a pretty clean lifestyle. And my objective is to feel like I'm in my 20s, even though I just turned 51. So
That's
That's
awesome.
that's the health side of it, which I think is foundational. And
Yeah.
then the second thing of the habits I'd say is just, gosh, I don't want to use this term, I hate the term, but it's like time management. So there, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to have my day proactively reflect my goals. So I want the things that I'm working on during the day to match up with my big goals that I've set for myself.
Hmm.
And the process for doing that for me is to spend about 2 hours a week with an executive coach. And we go over the goals. We go over how I did it last week, how I'm going to do this week, what I'm putting on my calendar. We refresh the 5-year goals, 1-year goals a couple times a year, or a couple times even a quarter, and just kind of like keep me directed toward what is important. And then taking out my calendar and literally scheduling those on my calendar. The way that overlaps with work is we spend at my firm, I would guess we spend more time than any other financial firm in the world using our imagination. So we I just got back this week. My 4 partners and I went to Half Moon Bay for 3 days and just asked big questions, looking out at the ocean. And it was messy, and we weren't sure where it was going. And we came up with just the most incredible breakthroughs. And like those 3 days are saving us 3 years of energy going down the wrong path. And I love that. That's where I really get my energy. So we spend a tremendous amount of time at Alpine in that kind of messy imagination, creative space, but it saves decades. And I think that's really uncommon, but I got that from all the work I've done with coaching, is just realizing how powerful it is to just get super clear on your intent.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hearing. It's like everything that you do in your life is very intentional and nothing is kind of on autopilot. That's really interesting. It reminds me, a few years ago, I interviewed Atomic Habits author James Clear, and he told me, I find that almost every thought I have is downstream from what I consume. If you have better inputs, you naturally get better outputs.
I love that.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you generate ideas. You kind of just mentioned in the business sense, but also content-wise, you have such a variety of topics on your blog and on TikTok and Instagram. But like, how do you just generate ideas on a daily basis?
For my content, you mean, or
For your content?
Yeah, for the content.
Content or business. Yeah.
Well, for business, it's asking the right questions. So in business, it is, how do we deliver? I'm not allowed to say this for SEC rules, but how do we deliver X performance? Yeah. And we're super, and then how would we do that in, half the time? If we were the best in the world at doubling revenue of a company in the first year, what would be true? Like, forget how we get there. There's this great coaching line, which is, the how is the killer of all great dreams. That's like my favorite quote. So don't worry about how we get there, but what would be true? We could do this, we do that. So in the business world, I think the questions are the hard part, and the answers are not as hard. And then the actual easiest part is taking what you aspire to do and working backwards from that. That's actually not that complicated. And you can get it down to where it's just what we call endogenous steps to get there. So the business, it's kind of asking the right questions, having the right people in the room, the right space. And and then on the content creation, I mean, it's not that magical. I keep a list of ideas that I have, and my list is way longer than I have time to produce. So I've always got 20 things that I'm excited about talking about or researching in many cases. Like, I just wrote this sleep blog, and a lot of that required a bunch of research as well, because I actually wanted to know the answer to these questions. So my blog and my content really just reflect my own journey through life. Whatever I'm struggling with or fighting or teaching or learning at work is kind of, I'm just sharing that along the way. So it's not, it just happens that I am in a bunch of journeys. So I'm running a private equity fund. I'm teaching at Stanford Business School. I'm raising teenagers. I'm fighting, trying to stay young. I'm doing a lot of the journeys that people are doing as well and want to learn about. So I'm just kind of sharing my own process as I'm going through it.
Yeah, I find that I do a very, very similar thing. You know how people say, oh, you should journal for yourself to work things out. I'm like, I don't feel like something's resolved until I write it and I share it publicly, because I think the feedback is what makes it really interesting, and you get more ideas out of that.
Yeah. And you know what? It's really cool, Paulina, is like I started teaching. So I started being a case guest at Stanford 2002, but I started teaching my own class in 2014. So about 10 years ago. And that ended up being the turning point for me being a great CEO also, because I would have to put frameworks on things. I would have to explain it. I'd have to stand in front of a room of students and say, you have to get rid of your B players. You have to do that. And then I look in the mirror and say, okay, I've got B players. I've got to, and so like just the forcing mechanism of you publishing it, teaching it, making a video, writing, it's just such a great forcing mechanism.
100%, because then you feel like a hypocrite if you're not living it.
That's right. And it doesn't mean, by the way, I do everything that I'm not perfect, but I certainly try to never stand up in front of a room or write a blog or a video about something that I'm not actually doing.
When I was at Fortune magazine and I turned in my first long form article, my editor said something that's stuck in my head ever since. He said that he was like, I can tell that your thinking is sloppy because your writing is sloppy. And I was writing in absolutes. I was writing things like nobody at the firm liked, the fund manager, or everybody agreed on this one thing. And he was like, that's not true. The world has nuance and context. And this is just very generic in general. So he forced me to like rewrite it where every single word meant something. But in doing that, I learned how to clarify my own thinking. So my question to you is, your writing is very clear and very to the point. Do you ever write with the hope of clarifying your thinking on something you may not know how you feel about yet?
100%. And the things you're reading that you're saying are clear did not start off as clear. They started off as Tim Ferriss said, right? 2 crappy pages. And they start off as 2 crappy pages. And that's like the best writing advice I've ever received. And it's because it's like, okay, well, my first draft can suck. And if I thought my first draft had to be perfect, I'd never make a first draft. You wouldn't even want to see my first drafts. They're so bad. And then I have, I might show them to, there's a couple of people that I work with and I share them. And this one woman, Audrey, who runs our marketing, she'll come back and say, Graham, you sound like a total douchebag private equity guy. I'll say, okay, all right, revise it. She tells me like exactly how it is. So then I take that, okay, read this, or hey, this doesn't make any sense, or no one's going to do that, or whatever, And so I definitely have some people that help me just with like, how does this come across? So yeah.
That's really interesting. I want to ask you about that actually. So you have a TikTok channel with 1 million followers. I saw that and I was like, wait, what? But the reason is you don't just talk about private equity. You talk about like the intersection of finance and entrepreneurship and personal growth. And it's actually really amazing content. But I'm curious, when you have, as somebody who has done video on the internet, I know that there's constructive feedback that's really helpful.
Oh my God.
And then there's just like unruly trolls who are just mad at the world. So
you're so right. That's a good way to say it.
So how do you deal with that, develop thick skin? And because you just said that, somebody on your team, it says a lot about your leadership style that people don't have a problem telling you sound like a douchebag. But how do you develop thick skin and write and put your work out there on the internet?
It is so hard. I mean, I don't know how thick my skin really is. it is amazing that what they'll say on there. It's unbelievable. And then sometimes I'll get something that's so brutal. I'll click on their account, just to see who this is. And it'll be like basically a ghost account, zero posts, zero followers, just like a shell of it's not like I don't even know what that is, and so I probably take that a little bit less seriously. And sometimes the feedback is constructive where I can like a good example would be I had, I posted, I might post something on goals and someone might say, well, how would this work? Yeah, that sounds easy for you to say, but I have a job that I need to make my rent. And how would I do that? And it's actually kind of like, it's a good point, and that's something that I hadn't thought about. And then I might make a post on that or something, or I might reply to the comment or something. So some of the feedback is really constructive and helpful to kind of see where the viewer or the listener is. But yeah, definitely the trolls. Some of it's just it's funny sometimes. I mean, even if it weren't directed at me, I would laugh, and so I don't know. I don't know that I have. I'd ask you the same thing, because I don't know that I have a super thick skin. Some of the stuff still kind of gets under my skin.
Yeah, I think in the beginning for me, definitely it got under my skin, but I recently published a book and I was in a really bad mood and my husband was like, what's wrong? And I was like, I don't know, Clean Freak 72 left a bad Amazon review on sometimes it does get to you.
Clean Freak 72.
No, it's true. So the profile readers are probably familiar with you because I recently included your Stanford talk. It was so good. It's called How to Live an Asymmetric Life. And my husband and I often talk about living an extraordinary life. So this really kind of was relevant. When did you start thinking about the fact that you wanted to live an asymmetric life?
I think back when I was 13 years old and I lived in a suburb of Toledo, Ohio, Rust Belt town, blue collar, pretty unextraordinary. My identity was that I was pretty unextraordinary, athletic wise and grades and everything. And I just wanted to feel, I wanted to try to be my own experiment on trying to see if I could be extraordinary. And it started with really little things and then kind of swept up my whole life, as you heard, everything from eating and alcohol and sleeping and running a private equity firm, all those things. It kind of has been my life purpose. It's and a lot of it has to do with, some, as we talked about earlier, an external goal, like, okay, I want to have these returns at my firm. So the endowments that give us money get a lot of money back to build buildings and give scholarships and all that. I mean, that's really profound and I'm super proud of that. But if I'm being really honest, it's really just because that's what I want for my life. That's how I measure myself, is like, if I'm going to go do something, I want to feel like I gave it every single ounce of energy that I have and I left everything on the field. That's just how that's just where I get my self-esteem from. And it doesn't matter if it was rowing crew or coaching my son's, little league team or teaching or running a private equity firm or playing tennis or whatever. Like it's just, I want to feel like I just gave it all that I had to the things I'm spending my energy on. It's just, it's how I guess the meaning of life is to figure out what's the meaning of life.
Yeah.
And that's kind of part of my meaning of life, is to try to see if I can be extraordinary and not for anyone else, but just for me.
Yeah.
And there are external benefits of that. Like I said, I mean, I think we're having a really big impact. I think I have an impact when I teach, and I really want to just be extraordinary because I want to be extraordinary too.
That's awesome. So when you mentioned you have these like performance metrics, let's say at the firm, or athletics wise, you have certain like weight benchmarks, whatever, but how much of it do you recommend people start with something like you can measure quantitatively versus something like I want to be happier or I want to worry less, or like mental habits versus I want to stop smoking or drinking?
I really, really like quantitative, measurable things. I think that there's something, again, like we go back to like, if you want to build your self-esteem, make and keep promises to yourself. And I'm going to go off on a tiny tangent here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to get dopamine, and we all spend almost our whole lives seeking dopamine. One way to get dopamine is to set and progress toward a goal. Like that, actually, the setting of a goal creates dopamine. The writing out the goal creates dopamine. The taking a step toward the goal creates dopamine. Completing a goal creates dopamine. That's a really healthy way to get your dopamine. There's a ton of unhealthy ways, which you're aware of: phone, alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, on and on and on. But that's a really powerful way to get it. And so if you can create a way that you can be measuring that yourself, it'll become like addictive in the best possible way. And so you could give, for example, I want to take a 3-minute cold plunge, and I'm going to do that 5 days a week. There's metrics, 3 minutes, 5 days a week, and you can make and keep that commitment to yourself. So even though it's like, I want to be healthier, well, that's intellectually lazy, right? Break that down a little bit. And by the way, only set one thing. How about 3 minutes a day in a cold? I made that up, but it could be 5 minutes a day of meditating. It could be, I'm going to not drink alcohol for the month of December. And making and keeping a small commitment, it just starts to give you confidence, and it's going to become addictive. But I do think there needs to be a way to measure it, so if you were successful or not.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think back, I'm like, when did I feel the best? And it was probably a year when I was training for a marathon that I did not do well at all running the marathon. But it's actually like that year, because of the tiny goals, every Saturday, long run, whatever. It's like, I felt good about myself for keeping those promises, even if I wasn't the fastest.
See, the great thing about that story, like the marathon isn't the thing. It's the Saturday morning when you got up at 7 a.m. and did the workout on that Saturday. Like that's the thing. The race is like not even part of the equation. I mean, I know everyone thinks that they're going to ask you what your time was, all that stuff, but like the real magic of that story was that on the random Tuesday, you got up and did your workout that day,
Exactly. So I encourage everybody to go watch your talk, but the one principle or piece that really spoke to me that I actually have rewatched a number of times is that anytime you want to make a change in your life will actually get worse first before it gets better. And I recently thought about something my dad told me about uncertainty, and he was like, you jump in the ocean, but you don't know how deep it is, but it actually doesn't matter if you can swim. And I was like, ugh, that's true. So how do you grapple with the idea that any change will feel horrible at first because you don't know which way it's going to go? And do you mentally prepare yourself for that? It's kind of like goes back to crisis leadership.
Yeah, I think the first part of it is the reason that I put that principle in there is that the first part of it is just being aware that that's true. Yeah. So let's say that I'm in a really toxic relationship, or actually, no, that's not true. Let's say I'm in a kind of toxic, it's not good. If it's a disaster, okay, I'm going to get out. But let's say it's just not that great. I'm going to if I stay in that relationship today, my day today will be better than if I get out of it.
If you stay in it, it'll be better?
I stay in it today, my day today on, December 1st is going to be better than if I ended it on December. Like just today will be better if I do nothing. Okay. Because if I actually end the relationship, I have to have a hard conversation. There's going to be tears. I'm going to be lonely. I'm going to second guess all these different things are going to happen that are going to all be negative. But on the other side of that is me being able to be in a great relationship. So as long as you the reason that I think it's important is to just realize that it's worse first. Mm-hmm. So yes, your next 2 weeks or 2 months is going to get worse if you get out of that relationship or change your job or start marathon training or whatever, it's almost always going to get worse. And that's why no one makes changes, because they don't want tomorrow to be worse. They want tomorrow to be great. But as soon as you start to realize that the first step is negative, but you do come out the other end, it gives you confidence to kind of make those changes.
Yeah, my husband and I stopped drinking 3 years ago, and I was like, oh, but then we have this party, and then we have to explain to people why we're not drinking. And then you realize over time, nobody cares. It's just, they move on. But it's like, it does in the beginning, you're just like, oh, this sucks.
Yeah. In the beginning, like the party, at least for me, the parties aren't quite as fun because maybe the conversation wasn't as good as you thought. You were just, a little drunk.
So you've said that reading voraciously is one of the greatest life hacks that you've ever adopted. What are your top 3 books that you would recommend to people who do want to make that like big life change?
I think the book Switch is about change, and it is by Dan and Chip Heath. I'd say that book specifically for life change, that's got to be on the list, because that's exactly what it's about. Those guys are great authors, and there's a few principles from that book that have been just absolutely life-changing. Specifically, they have this thing on scale your bright spots, find what's working and do more of that, shape your environment, some other things like that. So that would be one for making a life change. Specifically on making a life change, there's a book Poe Brunson wrote, which is, gosh, I can't remember the title, but it's Poe Brunson, and it's like, I'm sorry, I read it like 10 years ago. I'm saying this because it's specifically on the topic you mentioned. I'll look it up, but it's literally about people who change careers like dramatically, like went from Wall Street to working, volunteering in a hospital. It might even be called something like "What Should I Do with My Life" or something like that. I'd say those two. Specifically making a life change, and then probably pick up a book on goals. Really, Brian Tracy's I think he's the world's leading expert on goals, and he's got, I've lost track, but I think he has a book called Goals or something. He has like, that's what every book of his is about goals. But pick up one of his so you can kind of get clear on where you want to go and how to work backwards. I think he's the guru on that. So those would be a couple ideas.
And those are great. We'll go back and I'll add the name of the book when I find it. But for the New Year is coming up, and speaking of goals, a lot of people like to set New Year's resolutions and goals in the new year. But then comes this like messy middle of the year, like April, not really the middle, but people start to lose motivation. How do you suggest they power through?
So I think that actually people lose motivation like by like January 10th.
Or that.
If you actually look at the numbers, it's like April's great.
Yeah.
Declare victory.
We're almost there.
Yeah. I think that what people do wrong is they set goals that they set habits that are just unattainable. You go to the gym for 3 hours on January 1st. It's like, if you spend 3 hours brushing your teeth on January 1st, you still got to brush them on January 2nd and January 3rd and January 4th. So I think people just they just get all excited and like really, and this is a lot what James Clear talks about, but you just make it something that you can stick with. And this was one for me on meditation. I mean, it took me so many years to actually make that a habit. And then I just started with 5 minutes, and I was going to do 5 minutes no matter what happened before I even got out of bed. And then that became, what's now 30 minutes. But the reason I kept failing is I would try it too long, and I'd get discouraged. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then the second one would be accountability. So, so for me personally, I don't need accountability to go to the gym or take a cold shower, but I do need accountability for me to set my goals, work backwards from them, put them on the calendar. And so that's where I hire a coach who is my accountability.
Yes.
Here's what you said you were going to do. And I pay that person to, one coach I have, I can't even show up to the call without filling out a form that says, here's the goals. Here's what I said I was going to do last week. Here's what I did. Here's what I want the outcomes of this week to be. Like, even if I never had the call, the accountability of just even filling that out every single week is incredible. So you figure out where your weaknesses are and where you can have, someone that is holding your feet to the fire, and building that in is another. Those would be two ways: set them small and hold accountable. And by the way, the name of the book is "What Should I Do with My Life?"
Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Yeah, it was what I thought. Yeah.
So prior to this interview, I read a lot of your blog posts, but my favorite one was when you wrote about your oldest son going off to college. And I want to share this quote with people. It says, time is like an avalanche. It starts slowly, a snowball barely moving down the hill, but as it gathers speed, it also gathers momentum. Every older parent tells the younger parent it goes by fast because experience has forced them to realize that each phase with your kids will only happen once. You can't roll the avalanche back up the hill. Oh, that's crazy because
yeah, you just had a baby, right?
Yes,
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
9 days ago.
Yeah.
So, but because it was 9 days ago, right now we're in like the thick of waking up every 2 hours, the whole thing. So how should we make sure that we don't let kind of the everyday minutia steal away the joy of enjoying it now?
I think the biggest obstacle to enjoying kids and the biggest misconception is that you're going somewhere, So your kid you've got to teach your kid to walk. You've got to teach them to do this. Then they're in kindergarten. Now you've got to get them ready for first grade. And then they're on this, and then you got to get them this. And you're like, it's almost like there's somewhere to go. And the best thing I could say is like the point of your kid playing Little League when they're 7 is to play Little League when they're 7. It's not to play in the majors. It's not to play in high school, college, whatever. Maybe they do that, maybe they don't. But if you can kind of have each thing you do with your kids be the whole thing, like it's just about this. I think that's what I learned is like, because getting there is they're gone, right? So that's not a great goal. I mean, and so it took me a while to figure that out. I had this kind of mentor of mine give me this big talk about how, hey, your kid's not going to play baseball in college, whatever. And so it's about now. And so I'd say that's probably it sounds a little cliche, but if you can approach each experience with you having your kids, the whole point of that is just that one experience they're having, not that they need to go to this and get there and do something. I think that's probably the best advice I could give on that. That's
so good, because I had never thought about getting there is them leaving.
Yeah, getting there is they're out of the house, which is, by the way, things people don't tell you is the most heartbreaking thing ever. I'm sorry to say that, but no one ever prepared me for that.
Yeah, no,
you're a ways from that. You got a long time.
You say that, and then in 18 years, I'll be calling you. And my final question that I ask everybody I interview is, what does the word success mean to you? How do you define it?
A couple things come to mind for that. One is what we talked a little bit about, which is, the meaning of life is for you to figure out what the meaning of life is, and for you to actually take some time to define what that means. What is a life well lived mean for you? And I mentioned earlier one of the things that is on my list. And then I think, I think success, just like everything else, is an internal game. So it really doesn't matter what anyone else thinks success is. It matters what you think it is. And in many ways, you'll be a harder judge of yourself on that than anyone else. But in many ways, you might judge it differently than other people too. And like where you get stressed is when you're living in conflict and when your definition of success and how you're spending your time are not aligned. So the more time you can kind of figure out, like, what does it mean to me to live a good life? What does it mean to me to when I get to the end, what do I want to look back and feel about my life? And And then if you can be living toward that, I think you're gonna just remove a lot of friction and enjoy things a lot more. So I do spend a lot of time asking that question, and you just gotta be careful, because it's really easy to get off track and do the things that show up on social media, or the thing your boss, your parents, or roommate, or someone thinks you should be doing. And you'll know that, because you'll be feeling that in your gut. It won't feel easy. It won't feel energetic. It'll feel like you're stuck in the mud. And so give yourself permission to do what you want with this one life, even if it's something that no one else it's not anyone else's definition of success.
That's great. Yeah, you just said the phrase that I use to define success, which is a life well lived. And that means different things to different people, because ultimately success is very personal. What you may find successful, I may not, and vice versa. So that's really great.
One more thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was saying this to my friend the other day, which is like, okay, almost irrespective of your religion. Okay, I don't want to make this a religious thing, but you're done with your life, and the Christian religion is you're going to go up and you're going to be judged. Someone's going to let you into heaven or not. Well, before that, you're 90 or whatever, and you're looking back. You're St. Peter. You're the
Yeah.
one who's deciding how your life was lived, and like, it's not some third party. It's you. And so, like, live according to that bar and that standard, and
Mm.
it's going to be a good standard. If it's not some nebulous creature that's gonna, sorry, I'm getting religious now, but even if it is, I think ultimately it's going to be you who's the harder standard to live up
Mm.
to.
So it's almost like live as if your aspirational self is judging you.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Graham, thank you so much. This was excellent.
Thank you, Paulina. Super fun.
That's awesome.